awesome.
Hey everyone, Chris here, the RC Geek. Welcome back. In our last video, we talked about how we took the Hobby King Yak 11 and converted it into a true Reno Racer. And so in this video, we are finishing the airframe with paint. We're doing some aluminum foil application on the fuselage and then markings, of course. The subject aircraft is Czech Mate, and it did have a polished aluminum fuselage. And so to try and mimic that, we will apply Flite Metal onto the fuselage, which is a thin aluminum tape, and that does have some unique challenges with the foam airframe underneath. Otherwise, tails and wings, those were all painted as they were on the full-scale airplane. Before we get into it, I want to mention this video is sponsored by RTL Fasteners. As modelers, we need fasteners, and having a good assortment on hand is essential, and they have a huge assortment. For me personally, I keep on hand their metric and standard assortments, as well as their servo screw assortment. I use that one quite a bit, especially when I'm installing servos into airframes and such. I've got a link down in the description. Be sure to check them out. It really is good stuff. With that said, let's go. To start, as we look at Czech Mate, we see some distinct silver and blue painted areas, and of course the polished aluminum fuselage. This means silver and blue paint and the ever reflective Flite Metal aluminum tape for the entire fuselage. Let's begin. First, Tamiya AS12 silver was sprayed onto all of the painted areas. This consisted of the forward cowl, the inner flap well, the tails, and of course, the entire wing. On the large wing, and with any of the areas really, additional coats were sprayed as needed to ensure complete coverage over the entire surface. From there, small strips of frog tape were cut with an X-Acto knife and a straight edge, and were used to mask off the blue areas on the tail. The frog tape is used because it is less susceptible to pulling up the prepared surface underneath. Cutting it into small strips makes it more pliable for laying it down over a curved surface, and also for making curved paint lines too. In the process, it is important to ensure that the tape is pressed down along the edges so that it seals well. And so once that was down and masked to protect from overspray, Tamiya TS15 Blue was sprayed. The paint was applied in layers, meaning that the first coat was applied more lightly, especially around the tape lines. This is to avoid putting it on too wet, which helps to avoid the paint bleeding under the tape. Once dry, the moment of truth. Peeling up the tape. The tape was lifted up by peeling it back over itself to avoid pulling up any of the underlying surface. With all of the painted areas done, it was onto the polished aluminum fuselage. First, any areas I didn't want to apply foil over were painted with Krylon Color Max metallic aluminum. From there, to apply the Flite Metal foil tape, individual panels were masked off with frog tape first. The Flite Metal was cut to the approximate shape, and the backing carefully peeled off in a manner that avoided introducing small kinks or bends into it. At that point, the panel was applied to the surface using a soft towel and an artist blending tool as needed. Generally speaking, it was best to apply from the middle of the panel and work outward, but in some cases, you could work from one end to the other. Also, the material is soft and pliable, which means that it can be stretched around complex curves if needed. The blending tool was then used around the tape edges to get it to come through for cutting. All of the edges were cut using a straight edge where possible and a scalpel blade, and then peeled up one by one. It is important to cut just the foil tape, as you don't want to cut through into the fuselage. I'd like to say there's a shortcut here, but there really isn't. It just takes careful cutting and patience. Once all of the edges were cut and the tape removed, the edges were pressed down with the artist blending tool to seal it all. Lastly, any additional areas were cut as needed. In the case here, the vent hole in the rear fuselage. For the more complex curves, the artist blending tool was used exclusively. The foil tape was tacked in the middle of the panel, and then the Flite metal was worked around out to the edges. The material will stretch some, and it does require working with it to get it down well. This is where having a more rigid surface underneath like fiberglass to burnish the material down would be quite helpful. I should mention too that the material does have grain to it, so laying panels with the grain different directions really helps break up the surface in a very scale way based on how it reflects the light. Oh, and if you're not happy with one of the panels, you're better off just leaving it. It's not worth pulling up the underlying finish. In this case, I lightly sanded the lifted areas and reapplied the panel. It worked out okay here, but I learned my lesson. And so the whole fuselage was covered in this manner, panel by panel. All in all, I think it took about 20 hours to complete the foil tape application. It was definitely a process. That was a lot of work. During the process of covering the fuselage, the cockpit area had been cut away to match the canopy and painted black. I had 3D printed a pilot, and it was a matter of getting him painted with my stash of enamel paints and then hot gluing him into the airframe. Once in, the canopy was glued with Formula 560 canopy glue. The glue was added to all of the canopy edges first, and then the canopy placed onto the fuselage. Being water soluble, any excess was cleaned up with water and Windex and a paper towel. Once the placement was perfect, it was held down with tape, and any additional cleanup was made, and then it was allowed to dry. To finish out the canopy area, the canopy frame was lined with Flite metal to finish the look. A 1/2 inch strip was applied along the back, and all of the side and forward edges were then lined with a 1/8 inch strip that was cut from the material. To finish it all out, it was time for markings, of course. These came from Cali Graphics, which are adhesive-backed vinyl, and so they were applied by first cutting away part of the backing, and then once placed, tacking down the exposed adhesive and peeling away the rest of the backing while pressing the marking down onto the surface. Then, the transfer tape was carefully removed to ensure that none of the markings came up with it. And just like that, they were all applied over the entire model and she was done. While the Flite metal took some time, the end result was totally worth it. So the airframe is done, it's ready for flight. I will say it is a bit bittersweet because of the circumstances surrounding the full-scale airplane, as it was lost a while back along with its pilot. I'm really happy with how it came out. It mimics the full scale really well. With the aluminum on the fuselage, it just shines in the sun. So from here, it is time to get this model flown. I'm gonna stick with the stock propeller and spinner for now. I would like to look into potentially doing a more scale spinner along with a more scale 4-bladed propeller, but I want to stick with what I know for now, and then maybe we can experiment with that later. So be on the lookout for that. I plan to be flying this very soon. Otherwise, if you missed our last video, you can see that here. And until next time, I'll see you at the field.